Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association, and I welcome you to a presentation on the making of a leader, General George C. Marshall. We also welcome our fellow veterans who are viewing this program from the Edith North Rogers Memorial Veterans Hospital in Bedford, Massachusetts, and our fellow veterans from the Brockton VA Medical Center. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Paul Levengood. A native of Philadelphia, Paul Levengood received a BA at Davidson College and an MA and a PhD in American history from Rice University. His professional career has been spent in the public history field at the Virginia Historical Society, the Virginia War Memorial Foundation, and since 2019 at the George C. Marshall Foundation. The author of a book and several articles, Dr. Levengood continues to maintain an active scholarly agenda. His current research project examines the history of soccer in the United States. He has served in leadership roles in several professional and community organizations. The Marshall Foundation perpetuates Marshall's legacy through scholarship, leadership, and a research library that offer a wide range of resources and materials for use by the public, amateur historians, scholars, and students of all ages. So please welcome, via the magic of electronic wizardry, from Lexington, Virginia, and the campus of Virginia Military Institute, Paul Levengood.
I am pleased to be with you today. As you heard, I am Paul Levengood, president of the Marshall Foundation. And as Linda said, I come to you from Lexington, Virginia, one of your town's many namesakes. We were actually designated Lexington in 1778, a mere 3 years after the battle in your backyard. As Linda also mentioned, the Marshall Foundation is located on post at Virginia Military Institute, which was founded in 1839 and is the nation's oldest public senior military college. When someone asks me what the Marshall Foundation is, I say it's kind of like a presidential library without the president. So we are at Marshall's alma mater and have been here since 1964. And the organization itself has actually been in existence since 1953 during Marshall's lifetime, although over his heated protestations that such an institution was unnecessary to honor someone like him. So I appreciate all of you turning out today to watch what is essentially a disembodied head on a Zoom screen. And I will consider myself fortunate and the program to have been a success if I can keep a majority of you awake through my allotted time period. You can all still hear me, right? I'm not hearing anything from in the room, so I'm going on faith that this is all still working. I did want to thank the Lexington Veterans Association for the very kind invitation to appear in front of you all today, especially Jim Wood, who reached out initially with this invitation. I think through his connection here at VMI. I know he's a proud alum of the Institute. So thank you, Jim, and thank you, Linda and Jim Ramsey, and all the other helpful people with whom I've been in contact preparing for this presentation. And let me just say, spend a couple of moments on your website in the last couple of days, and what an impressive organization you were all part of. You seem to be an exceptionally active and engaged group, as your website shows. I actually saw those pictures on your website earlier today, and it is really terrific that to see this group of veterans and so interested in not only getting together, but also helping their community. I'd like to also welcome to the talk those others watching online, especially those at the VA medical centers. I think it's a great thing to have these programs streamed in for those who cannot be there in Brookhaven in person. Now, as Linda said, my subject this afternoon is George Catlett Marshall, specifically how he became a leader and what I believe the tenets of his leadership style were. Now, let me say that there is no single type of leadership, as we all know. And I am certainly not an expert on leadership. It's become quite the in vogue discipline in some colleges and universities to study leadership and teach leadership. And I am not from that kind of a background. I'm a historian. Now, many people apparently are leadership experts these days. Just look at the books you could find on Amazon on leadership, from Sun Tzu to Machiavelli, and from Nick Saban to Coach K. It's clearly a very popular topic, no shortage of titles on leadership. But what I'm going to do for you this afternoon is briefly highlight an example of one leader and how he came to be that leader. And I hope that you find this interesting and, more importantly, somewhat helpful. Now, when I speak to groups, I usually begin by asking, how many of you know who George C. Marshall is? So, show of hands, who knows who George C. Marshall was? All right, I see most of the hands. It looks good. In a room full of veterans, I would hope for this response. But because Marshall's resume shines like so few in our history, let me just remind you, even those of you who know who he is. Marshall was Army Chief of Staff, who was the architect, in many ways, the architect of Allied victory in World War II. He was the first American soldier to be named a five-star general. He was Secretary of State, whose vision helped rebuild Western Europe after World War II through the plan that was named after him, the Marshall Plan. He was Secretary of Defense during the Korean War. He was the only career soldier to ever receive the Nobel Prize for Peace. And he was a man who counted world leaders like Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and even Joseph Stalin as his great admirers. Well, with a record like that, you'd think George C. Marshall must have been born a leader. But in many ways, you would be wrong. As a child, Marshall was no leader. In fact, he would argue he was a follower, and it often got him into trouble, both in the classroom and out. His behavior and his grades as a young man were so poor that when his brother Stuart, a recent Virginia Military Institute graduate, heard that his younger sibling was applying to his alma mater, he begged his parents not to let George go. He feared that his younger brother would disgrace the family by his performance, his lack of direction at the Institute. Well, maybe just to prove his brother wrong, Marshall showed up as a 16-year-old at VMI in 1897. As an aside, Jim Wood could probably tell you what it's like to be a VMI rat in your first year at VMI, because his experiences may have looked fairly similar to Marshall's. But at VMI, something sort of amazing happened in Marshall. Although he remained a mediocre student at best, finished sort of middle of his class in class rank, George Marshall took to military training like a duck to water. On the parade ground, in the close order drill, in learning the structures and disciplines of military life, George quickly rose through the ranks. And by his final year at VMI, he was regimental commander. And everyone who met him actually mentioned the eyes, very intense blue eyes that looked right into you from all comments. So I was saying that Marshall became regimental commander at VMI, which was the highest rank in the Corps of Cadets. And he came to take it as a great source of pride that others looked to him for direction and as a way to model their own behavior. He was especially interested and seemed gratified by the interest in younger cadets to follow his example. He had become, in his 4 years at VMI, for the first time, a leader. And he did it, I would argue, not because he had a natural gift, but because it was something he focused on and consciously nurtured, both at VMI and for the rest of his life. Well, how did he do that? How did he nurture the leadership abilities that before VMI had seemed to be quite absent in many ways from his makeup? Well, I'm a historian, as you heard, so I tend to work with concrete, chronologically based examples. They sort of make more sense to me. And I'm going to use a few from throughout Marshall's life and career, where I show you some leadership principles that Marshall developed and lived by. And we will walk through his career in that way. Okay, the first takes place during World War I. Just by way of background, many of you might know that at the time he graduated from VMI, there was no automatic commissioning process. There was no ROTC training. VMI was a state school, and the peacetime army was very, very small. Marshall did not get his automatic commission. In fact, he had to go to Washington and petition the government for a seat at the placement exam, which he did. He actually ended up sitting in the White House to wait for a moment of President McKinley's time, where he was able to then secure a spot at the examination. He took the exam, finished very high, and was made a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army in 1898. And he served in a variety of posts, including in the Philippines and across the United States throughout the 19 aughts and teens. And in World War I, as seen in this picture, you should be seeing a picture of young Captain Marshall standing there on the right of the screen. This is during World War I. Marshall was a young officer helping train the very green troops of the 1st Infantry Division, who were among the first to arrive in France in 1917, in the final days of that conflict. Marshall was literally training these young men to fight only a few miles behind the front lines, just before they would be thrust into one of the most brutal wars in world history. Remember, the United States Army was exceedingly small. So most troops who went overseas had never not only seen any combat experience, they barely had any army experience and were, as a result, not ready for the terrible death and destruction of the Western Front. And frankly, the whole thing was a bit of a mess. The soldiers didn't have proper equipment. And when the commanding American general, the leader of the American Expeditionary Forces, John J. Pershing, seen here in the photo on the left, well, he came to check out the 1st Infantry Division's progress. Came to check on the unit Marshall was assigned to, and Pershing could not believe how poor the results were that he saw. And he started criticizing the commander of the 1st Red One in front of Marshall and all of the rest of the men. Well, something in George C. Marshall, some sense of fairness and an unwillingness to let that unfairness go unchecked, well, something sort of snapped inside Marshall. Risking his entire Army career, as Pershing left to leave this dressing down he had just done of the division and its commander, he took hold of Pershing's arm, physically grabbed his arm, turned Pershing around, and proceeded to tell him why his criticisms were so unfair. Now, observers assumed that Marshall would soon be packing his bags, would be court-martialed, deep-sixed out of the Army, and sent packing back to the United States for this insubordination. But something rather remarkable happened next. The general, General Pershing, somehow he heard something in this young officer's voice. He heard something that was in many ways refreshing to him. He heard the truth, an unvarnished opinion. And when you are at that elevated level of authority, be it in the military or any other place, that kind of honesty and candor is often in short supply. And so perhaps the thought ran through his mind for a moment of rebuking this young officer, but instead he stopped for a moment and he didn't kick him out of the army. He didn't send him uh, to the stockade. Instead, he brought Marshall onto his staff. And Marshall would go on to become a key planner uh, of American offensives at places like Saint Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne to end the war. And Pershing thought so much of Marshall's abilities, he actually brought him on board as his aide de camp after the war when Marshall went back to serve as chief of staff of the U.S. Army. So, what are the leadership lessons? What did Marshall learn in this moment, in this period in World War One? Well, in addition to learning some very practical on the ground matters of what's like in wartime, he learned, I think, from this episode and from his involvement with Pershing, to not be afraid to speak truth to power. This is a phrase we hear all the time, but this is a great example of it. Marshall took the chance, knowing that his career might be on the line, to say something that he thought needed to be said, to speak. And he had, in this case, he had the truth on his side. He could tell the general that yes, the training was not going well, but he also could tell the general, we don't even have rifles, we don't have proper uniforms, we don't have a ready supply of food. All these practical considerations that he thought Pershing needed to know, he mentioned them to them on the spot. And I think just as importantly as speaking truth to power, this is a great example of Marshall's unswerving loyalty to his team. He had been a team player on the football field at VMI, as a young officer in the Philippines and other places. And here he is showing that he was not going to simply let this episode with a superior officer go unchecked. He was going to stand by his commander in the first, and he was going to stand by those men who were trying so hard to be trained under such adverse conditions. So, leadership lessons from this early episode to take away, and that I believe Marshall took away and used the rest of his career. Now, after the war, Marshall had a number of Army posts, including spending almost a couple of years in China, but he underwent some terrible personal tragedy in the post-World War I years as well. His first wife, Lily, died in September of 1927, and Marshall found himself adrift. He put in for and received a transfer from Washington, where he had been stationed, to Fort Benning. He wanted to do something where he could throw himself into his work and try and not be preoccupied every moment with the death of his wife. So he did. He was sent to Fort Benning in 1927 to serve as assistant commandant of the infantry school there. This was a vitally important moment for Marshall and how he developed both as an officer and a leader. But it was vitally important for the Army and for the nation at the same time. He completely changed the way American infantry officers would be trained, not just in the 20s, but through the period before World War II and beyond. And he did that by using the hard lessons of World War I to try and make sure that we as a country and that the officer corps would be ready for the next war, because he knew that another war was likely. America would be drawn into another conflict. He learned about the tragic consequences of trench warfare and how modern weapons made stationary targets just a deadly practice in World War One. He learned the importance of mobility, but most important, he learned that officers need to be empowered to make decisions, to take their initiative in situations of high stress and high pressure and high peril. And he used all these things as a guiding principle and turned out a generation of leaders that were smart and flexible, who could make decisions under the most trying circumstances. Now, during his time overseeing this new way of training officers, Marshall made it a point to seek out the best soldiers he came into contact with and involve them in this process. So many of the names that we will all recognize with any basic World War II reading uh, are here at Benning, either as instructors, his picture of Marshall and all his or his top instructors. You might notice Omar Bradley, who stands second from left. Um, uh, Joe Stilwell is in this picture, and including those two uh, prominent officers in World War II. More than 200 future generals went through training at Benning um, under Marshall's time there as commandant and the curriculum he developed. These Marshall's men, as they came to be called, included Matthew Ridgway, Beadle Smith, Lawton Collins, James Van Fleet, Jacob Devers, as well as Stilwell and Bradley. And it was really these talents that Marshall and his faculty nurtured. I mean, they became the backbone of the Army that won World War II. And he truly believed in something, I think, and this is a tenet of good leaders, and I think maybe we can all recognize this in leaders we've seen in our own lives. He said, he thought if you pay attention to picking the right people, being clear about what you require of them, and then trusting them to do their jobs, success would usually follow. Now, it's long been a myth that Marshall had a little black book, some little notebook that he kept the names of good officers in, and when he had the authority to appoint them to important positions, that he consulted his book. Well, I can tell you, I don't believe there was ever a little black book. I think that book was in Marshall's head, where he kept track of the men that he thought were especially good leaders, who were especially smart, adaptable, who were tactically flexible. And he kept that material in his head. So when he was chief of staff during World War II, he did deploy it. Now, I would also say Marshall was pretty tough if you did not measure up to his standards. If you were one of the students at Benning and you were not getting the picture, you were not doing well, Marshall had no hesitation about telling you so and making sure that you went somewhere else. He did not have a long patience for incompetence. But if you showed him dedication, commitment, competence, intelligence, he was incredibly loyal to you. And it's no mistake that from, throughout Marshall's career, from people like Dwight Eisenhower down to the men on this picture, uh, many of these American warriors would agree that there was never a better commander, never a better boss than George C. Marshall. He cared for these men as people, not just as soldiers. He was interested in them spending time with their families. He was trying to make sure that they had adequate rest, that they were not worked to death. This was important to him. And he wanted to show them that he had confidence in their abilities and he would help them to be their best. Marshall was famously not a micromanager. I'll give you one example of this. And I think we've all worked for micromanagers and we know how demoralizing that can be. During World War II, Marshall is obviously running the war from Washington. Uh, and the problem of George C. Patton uh, comes onto his radar through Dwight Eisenhower. Now, by this time, Patton has already had that couple of soldier slapping incidents in hospitals. Uh, he has made bad press, and most recently, in April of 1944, he gives a disastrous speech at Knutsford in England, where he basically says in front of the assembled British press that the United States and the Soviet Union will dominate the post-war world, and that Great Britain might as well just get used to being a former has-been power on the world stage. And the British press just lights up. It's a absolute brush fire, bad publicity. And Eisenhower approaches Marshall and says, "What should I do about Pat?" And Marshall says, "Well, you're his commander. Uh, you have to be the one to decide what to do with him. And he's certainly given you plenty of reason to remove him from command of the Third Army, but that's your call. I can also tell you he is as fine a fighter as we have in this army." Now, obviously, Eisenhower decides to give Patton another chance, and Patton goes on to be an extremely effective combat commander in the push across Western Europe to end World War II. But it's a great example of telling you, look, I'm not going to tell you how to do your job unless you give me a reason to. I'm going to let you do your job, and I'm going to back you on the results. And that's exactly what Marshall did with Eisenhower, with Patton. So the leadership lessons that I think Marshall developed in his Benning years and beyond. Success is not about you. It's not about the leader. It's about the strength of the team you develop. You should always empower those who work under you. As I said, until they give you a reason to doubt them, don't support, and you must support them. You should care for them as people, and you should get out of their way. Don't micromanage. Don't assume that you have more information than the person actually doing the job, and how it needs to be done properly. So, of course, the next significant episode to treat is Marshall's role in World War II. Now, when Churchill and Truman and other leaders single Marshall out as the architect of victory, as the true genius behind coordinating a global war after 1941, orchestrating the movement and equipment of millions of men and women from one side of the world to the other, while balancing conflicting demands of allies, of the British, the French, the Soviets, not to mention a U.S. Congress that then, as it is clearly now, had its share of challenging, shall we say, challenging personalities. Uh, this was Marshall's great genius. He was able to do this. This is a photograph of Marshall at his map table in his War Department office. Hap Arnold is behind him. For those of you who recognize General Arnold, at this time, Marshall, as Chief of Staff of the Army, was also in control of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Although Hap Arnold was his very trusted subordinate along those lines. Well, Marshall was so skilled at directing the war, and the Allied results of success as they began to come, especially in 43 and 44, that when it finally came time to invade Europe, to launch Operation Overlord, the final hoped for death blow for Nazi Germany, almost everyone, from Churchill to Stalin, for that matter, assumed that Marshall would be in command, and they said so. They said so publicly. It was just sort of, they thought, a foregone conclusion that uh, the foremost leader in the American military would direct the Allied invasion. Well, if you know your history of Normandy and D-Day on June 6th, you recognize Marshall's name is nowhere to be found in the accounts of this. That's because despite all those assumptions, the command went to Dwight Eisenhower. Now, how did that happen? How did this monumental decision get made? Well, when President Roosevelt asked Marshall if he wanted command, FDR had a very oblique way of doing most things. He didn't often address issues head on. He would sort of do them from the side. He would make veiled references, but he eventually did ask Marshall, uh, General Marshall, do you want command of the cross-channel invasion of Europe? Marshall said to him, "That's not appropriate for me to weigh in on. That is a decision that the commander in chief should make, and I'm here to carry out whatever the orders from the commander in chief are." He refused to state a preference. Marshall did this from a deep-seated feeling. Not only had he imbibed so clearly the proper role of the military as subordinate to civilian control, but he also thought it was inappropriate for a servant of the nation to ask for special treatment for himself. And he didn't want FDR's decision making to be clouded by the emotion of rewarding a trusted subordinate with their wishes. And I'll tell you, Marshall, although he wouldn't say it, he desperately wanted the prize. He desperately wanted to command Overlord. He was a great student of history. He knew that history remembers best the generals who lead troops into battle. I mean, think in your own mind of, you know, the top 10 most well-known generals that you can think of. Very few of them, I would hazard a guess, were not battlefield commanders. They were not logisticians, planners, um, diplomats, all the roles that Marshall had to play during World War II. But it's on the battlefield that generals make their ultimate reputation. And that was the one thing that was missing from his resume. He had not commanded troops in World War I because he had been taken on as a planner on Pershing's staff. And he understood, though, that this decision must rest with the president. So, of course, the president famously, at the Second Cairo Conference in December of 43, brings Marshall to him for a meeting and utters the words that both must have flattered Marshall, but also devastated him in some ways. He said, "General Marshall, I feel I could not sleep at night with you out of the country." And with that, the command goes to Ike, to Dwight Eisenhower. And of course, Eisenhower became world famous for his role at D-Day. And ultimately, you would certainly be persuasively argued that that was the first step of Eisenhower to the White House. Now, I don't think Marshall had any pretensions or any ambitions at high elected office after the war, but certainly from a historical reputation, Eisenhower becomes, you know, arguably one of the most famous Americans of his time, whereas Marshall seemed content to continue to play that more background role. And I would tell you also, as an example of just what kind of a true, thoughtful, caring boss Marshall was, he actually took the note that Roosevelt jotted down appointing Eisenhower, the handwritten note appointing Eisenhower to Supreme Allied Commander of the Overlord invasion, and he signed it and said words to the effect, "Ike, uh, thought you might want this as a souvenir. This is the evidence of you, your the command decision," and had it sent to Eisenhower, who treasured it the rest of his life. In fact, when Eisenhower was here in Lexington helping dedicate this building, he mentioned that note as something that uh, moved him to this day. So, what's the leadership lesson you can take away from this World War II moment, this D-Day Overlord command decision? Well, I think that good leaders are selfless, and that personal glory on a truly successful venture cannot be the point. Success of the mission has to be the focus of you as a leader. Now, my final example of the traits by which Marshall developed his own style of leadership and displayed it is really during the achievement that is best known and connected with his name, and that is the Marshall Plan. In early 1947, less than 2 years after the end of World War II, Europe was still devastated. Its cities, I'm trying to remember whether that's Dresden on the right, but it's a German city on the right, were still in ruins. Its economy was shattered and people were starving to death. That demonstration is in Vienna in 1947. And in many ways, it seemed realistic that the Soviet Union would take advantage of all this chaos and bring the entire continent under its thumb. The European countries had already been largely dominated by the Soviet Union, and to many, it became very perilous prospect that the same would happen in countries of Western Europe. Remember, in this point, Italy and France are the communist parties in Italy and France are making big electoral inroads, and it seemed like this chaos and destruction was going to lead to a total reordering of European geopolitics. Well, as the new Secretary of State under President Truman, Marshall learned the seriousness of this problem in no small part at a foreign ministers conference in Moscow that he attended right after he was um, he was confirmed as Secretary of State. And he came back and told his staff, we need to find a solution. We are not going to sit around and wait for this. As he said, the patient is failing while the doctors deliberate. In 2 weeks, policy planning staff he set up at the State Department, uh, especially under the brilliance of one of its staff members, George Kennan, um, created a European recovery plan, and it was on Marshall's desk. This attempt to save Europe was a combination of many things, of humanitarian relief. Think of that picture of hunger and starving people, of economic assistance and geopolitical strategy. It proposed to spend billions of dollars and was the most ambitious and important American foreign policy effort ever, certainly since the Louisiana Purchase. There was just one small problem. The country had just gone through a war that cost billions and billions of dollars and cost more than 400,000 American lives. Now, the last thing most Americans wanted in 1947 was to spend more money solving problems across the ocean. This feeling made Congress skeptical of, even hostile to, the Marshall Plan and its price tag. Now, I would argue no other American could have gotten the bill authorizing this plan passed through Congress. No one except George C. Marshall. Even the president knew that. He begged that this not be called or nicknamed the Truman Plan, because as he said, half of Congress will never vote for it. The Marshall Plan, as a name, he knew, though, would command respect. And that's because through his years in Washington, Marshall had built a reputation for absolute integrity and honesty. He was also known to be completely nonpartisan. Marshall famously, as many military officers, to be fair, have, but he publicly told anyone who asked him that he had never voted in an election in his life. He famously joked that his father was a Democrat, his mother was a Republican, while he was an Episcopalian. Um, but his honesty, his integrity, his nonpartisanship was so well known that across the aisle, Democrats and Republicans would trust that anything Marshall put his name to, anything he brought to them and said, this is important, this is vital, they could trust that, and that American funds would be well spent on this. And Marshall testified. He testified in Congress. He spoke in front of trade groups. He spoke to church groups. He used the bully pulpit of his secretaryship to promote an interest in and a general approval for this plan. And he used the three things I mentioned. To some groups, he could stress the humanitarian crisis, children starving, hunger stalking the continent of Europe. How do we deal with human suffering? To some, he could stress the geopolitical importance that we can't let the Soviets march across Europe. We recognize the threat to the Western world, democracies, the free market system, if the Soviets were to suddenly take control of Germany, France, Britain, and so on. And to others, when he spoke to the manufacturing interests, to finance groups, he would point out that Western Europe was the biggest market for American goods before the war. And if you wanted a robust European trading partner, you would need to do something to help them rebuild infrastructure. So he had a way to pitch this proposal. And in an incredibly short period of time, it went from proposal and in early 1948 to Congress passing the European Recovery Act, the Marshall Plan, and the rest, as they say, is history. It cost about $13 billion in 1947 dollars, still less than $250 billion today. And I think I would argue it is no exaggeration to say that it saved Western Europe and was probably the best investment that the United States has ever made in maintaining Western Europe as our greatest ally and biggest trading partner. It led to the creation of NATO and the European Union, which both contributed to the longest period of prolonged peace in modern European history. And for his work, he received the Nobel Prize in 1953. Well, what are the leadership lessons, as I see them, the leadership traits that Marshall exhibited at this crucial moment as Secretary of State? Well, one is that vision is key. We hear this. The first President Bush, I remember him talking about. Someone asked him vision, kept asking questions about his vision for the post Cold War era. And at one point, President Bush got frustrated and said, "Oh yeah, that vision thing again." Well, Marshall, for him, vision was key. Looking at things and seeing a big picture. This is the sort of thing I think that he developed very much during the war. Being that leader in Washington, had to maintain that big picture, had to make choices based on big, broad scope of view of what was taking place. So seeing that big picture are key, not letting yourself get bogged down in every detail, but saying, there's a big problem. It needs to be solved. How do we do that? And also, you have to remember to build your credibility. Build your credibility with the people who work for you, with the people who are your partners, your customers, your various constituencies, as Congress was for him, because you will eventually need that credibility. It will ultimately be the reason you get things done. And your character and credibility are something that once they're lost, well, very difficult to regain it. So you need to save it. You need to make sure that it's there for you when it's absolutely vital. So I've walked you through George C. Marshall's development of his leadership style, what I think we can take away from it in a kind of a chronological basis. And that's kind of the end of the meat of my presentation today. But let me just ask you for a few moments for what, if you remember Click and Clack from Car Talk, they used to call the shameless commerce section of their radio show. Well, this is the shameless commerce section of my presentation. I know that this is a room of accomplished people and patriots, and I certainly don't presume to suggest how you may harness your leadership skills. You've already harnessed them. You've already shown them in your lives and careers. That's clear. But I think it would be important for me to make sure that you go away from today knowing that the work of my organization, of the George C. Marshall Foundation, is to use the leadership lessons so perfectly embodied in one man's life to inspire current and future generations. And that's what we're trying to do here at the Marshall Foundation. We made the strategic decision that it's not enough for us to try to make sure that people know of Marshall's accomplishments, let's say the what of Marshall, although they're numerous and extremely important. No, we feel that the most vital thing about him are the underpinnings of his character, his leadership that guided his life and career, if you will, the why of George C. Marshall. They are, I think, what allowed him to become the history-shaping figure that he was. Those various leadership moments or lessons I discussed. And our programs increasingly are trying to drive home this point. For example, we're in the midst of a massive project to digitize the George C. Marshall papers, which are here. It's more than 400,000 documents. They are going to be made available publicly through our website at no charge, and the process is already starting. I would urge you to look around our website. The World War II years are already posted, and we're working on other sections of Marshall's career. And we do that not just to make these available to researchers around the world. We do it because through the work of authors, of scholars, of students, Marshall's character his personal qualities, his leadership, are shown. They're revealed to be what set him apart from his contemporaries and what make him such a unique figure in American history. Similarly, when we launched a seminar for secondary school teachers in the summer of 2023, it was not only so those hardworking educators had better ways of teaching the Marshall Plan or World War II or the Cold War to their students. We did it to get them to understand the why of these events and why Marshall is so key to understanding them. And this allows them to go back to their classroom to communicate the groundings of the history of learning the events, of making sure their students know that, but also why Marshall's bedrock principles, why his leadership was so important in those events. So hopefully they do that and they can go back and help develop the next generation of leaders. And I think you all probably agree with me and with most people I talk to that leadership is not something in great supply in our world today. We need more leaders. Not all of us will become five-star generals, but all of us, all leaders today and leaders yet to come, can find opportunities in their professions, in their communities, in their families. And, in George C. Marshall, they can see someone who at age 18 didn't resemble a leader, but he found a role for himself. He decided to work to cultivate those traits, and they allowed him to lead. So, as a fully private nonprofit, we rely on the generosity of individuals and organizations who see value in what we do. And I hope that you enjoyed what I've discussed here. Hope you got something out of it and feel inspired to help us carry out our work. We're always looking for new avenues of support. And I would close by saying, in a world beset by peril and often bereft of wise, principled leadership, that kind of support, our work has never been more important. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Okay, we would be pleased to take your questions. Bob will take this half of the room. And
Some brewing questions.
remember, you're all trained very well, but when it's your turn to ask a question, wait and speak into the microphone, if you will. Okay, Bob, you go first.
I'm the wife of a veteran, and my husband would be happy to share with you the fact that I'm a detailed person. So my question is much more mundane than anybody else's will be, I think. What happened to Marshall's brother?
Marshall's brother went on through his training as an engineer to a nice, modest life working in the private sector. He certainly was not a terrible failure by any means, but I certainly think that the Marshall brother who came out ahead was George, not Stuart. And interestingly enough, not only was George upset by Stuart's comments before he went to VMI, uh, but Stuart had courted Lily when he was a cadet at VMI, and Lily had spurned him. George courted her, married her, and Stuart said something very unkind about Lily. And George basically never spoke to him again. So he remained very close to his sister, but very distant from his brother until their deaths.
But you mentioned primarily the European theater and Marshall's role in it. What about the Pacific theater and Marshall's role in overseeing action and the aftermath after the war in the Pacific theater?
The aftermath. Well, I mean, I can speak a little bit about. I mean, obviously, Marshall was chief of staff of the Army and responsible for Army forces in the Southwest Pacific. And along those lines, it occupied a great deal of his time. Uh, he, one of his most challenging one of the most challenging elements of his work along those lines really was how to deal with Douglas MacArthur, as you might not imagine. MacArthur obviously had been chief of staff of the army, was a legendary figure, but was extraordinarily difficult and held, shall we say, a rather high opinion of himself. That command challenge was very, very difficult, especially in light of the fact that, unlike Europe, the Pacific Theater was considered a primarily Navy area of operations. So, in many ways, although the Pacific occupied a certain amount of his time, Europe was much more at the forefront of Marshall's um, time. Now, the one thing that Marshall is responsible for was the establishment of the Joint Chiefs. It's a wartime innovation, partly modeled on the British model, where he saw how the British service commanders came together and had a regular venue in which they could discuss and consult. But of course, he insisted that a Navy officer be chairman of the Joint Chiefs because FDR was clearly a naval guy. So, Marshall's role in the Pacific was in support and in helping conceive grand strategy, but not as down in the weeds as the European theater. And in terms of post-war reconstruction in Asia, well, of course, this is a story. Marshall retires in November of 1945. He is exhausted after the war. Truman immediately pulls him out of retirement and sends him to China for all of 1946 to try and broker a peace between the nationalists and the communists. And Marshall fails at this, and it's the great regret of his life that he was not able to achieve a better result. And in his time as Secretary of State, Europe becomes the main focus and the reconstruction of Europe. There is some reconstruction of Japan, very little of China, but the American effort really focuses on Europe. But that one episode in China becomes a great source of regret for the rest of Marshall's life, that he was not able to achieve his objective. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you for a really phenomenal performance. I have never in my life heard such a fine presentation, and I'm most grateful to you, sir.
Thank you very much.
My question is a little bit about the personality of Marshall that you can illustrate best of all. Has to do with his quality, with his personality, with his individuality. And that question is, he had a certain sensitivity about his first name. Can you give us a little bit of background about that sensitivity, which to me says a great deal about General Marshall?
Well, you may be referring, if I'm following you, you may be referring to. He was a very formal man in many ways, although behind the scenes, his family talks about him letting his hair down and being a lot of fun and willing to joke around, but in certainly his public life, he was very formal. Of course, he was very much a Victorian in some ways, so that was not completely atypical of people. I mean, he was born in 1880. Was not he was not an informal type, but he was fairly reserved and austere. And even most of his close friends, when he wrote them a letter, he signed it Marshall and addressed it to them as by their last name, Eisenhower. He only had a few people that called him George among his professional contacts, and they were usually people he had known for decades, colleagues he had known for decades. The famous moment of Marshall's life, and I think this expresses a bigger point about Marshall that I'll mention. When he was the assistant chief of staff. He was pulled into a meeting in the White House with Roosevelt and a bunch of other muckety mucks, and he's kind of sitting in the back of the room. And as it was his wont, Roosevelt kind of pontificated about something. In this case, it was a question of air power and airplane production. And Roosevelt seemed to think that that would be the solution to whatever might ail the American military. And when he went around the room, the commander in chief, the boss, kind of asked everybody, "Well, what do you think?" And they all said, "Oh, yes, Mr. President. Yes, Mr. President. That sounds right. That sounds right. Yes, yes, of course, sir. Yes, of course. Yes, of course." And he kind of got to Marshall last. This fairly new addition had not been in Washington doing this kind of work for very long. And FDR looks at him and says, "Well, what do you think, George?" And Marshall said, "First of all, Mr. President, I'm General Marshall, and I think you're wrong." And went on to explain that in his point, all the production in the world was not worth much without the personnel that was needed. That was Marshall's big push, was you have to expand the size of the military if we're going to fight a modern war in Europe and potentially in the Pacific. And the personnel question was the one that just drove him. I mean, he's kind of the father of the peacetime draft, first peacetime draft in American history. But the question about his name, Marshall made a point to do that. Well, I don't think it was out of some sort of pig-headed pride. I think he wanted to maintain a very healthy divide between the commander-in-chief, between the leaders of the civilian government and his role as a military advisor. That if you, as Roosevelt loved to do, because he loved to be chummy and he loved to, get people out on his boat, which Marshall never would do. He would never go out on a cruise on the Augusta or whatever boat Roosevelt was using. Wanted that to have that distance because he thought it was a much more effective way of being able to provide good, unbiased advice. So he resisted the social connections that Roosevelt liked to make, and that was a great way to remind him. And to his credit, FDR called him General Marshall the rest of FDR's life. Didn't call him George again. Did not take offense, just as Pershing did not. And again, this is an area where I think Marshall, his candor at disagreeing with the president and politely reminding the president of the role, it actually became something that FDR would value, as Pershing had valued, as Truman would value after Roosevelt.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, you're welcome.
To what extent is Marshall studied and honored in Europe today?
Far more than in the United States. Sad to say. I think the Europeans, as they do maybe in some ways better recognize World War II in general. I mean, if you've ever been to Normandy or you've been to Bastogne, you'll see, I mean, a generation who never experienced the war still grateful and recognizing the American role in the war. And the same goes true for Marshall, especially when it comes to the Marshall Plan. Just remember that the Marshall Plan affects, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of Europeans, many of whom to this day still heard the stories from parents, from grandparents about what that American aid meant for them. Not in sort of a big geopolitical context necessarily, but just we were finally able to get enough calories to survive. We got heat. We got employment back because they rebuilt factories and railroads and ports. And the European governments have been extraordinarily grateful in recognizing the Marshall Plan. The British government commemorated this with a thank you gift of, if you ever hear of Marshall Scholarship, which is like a Rhodes Scholarship, they give it to American students. That's in thanks for the Marshall Plan. The West German government established something called the German Marshall Fund to thank the United States for it, and it's a mechanism by which the United States and Germany are meant to stay committed to exchange and communication between the two peoples. The Austrians did the same thing. Other countries did similar things. There are things named for Marshall in Europe. The Marshall Plan is still well remembered. I wish it's part of my organization's goal to continue raising Marshall's profile in the United States, even as it stays very high in Europe.
Uh, Can I ask a question? I was born in China. My father was a general in Chiang Kai-shek's army in 1948. We all
Mhm.
escaped to Taiwan. After Chiang Kai-shek's diary was opened up for people to read, in it, he said, I hated three people. Top of the list is General Marshall. And coming from China, of course, we listened to what they told us. But today, you did a tremendous job to tell us how great a leader, a general he was. But I think at the end, when this person asked about the Pacific battleground, you mentioned, did General Marshall have some regrets about how he handled the Mao Zedong, the communists, and the Chiang Kai-shek's party?
Well, yes, and I tried to say his great regret was his inability to find a solution to the Chinese Civil War, and he was firmly an anti-communist, so regretted the result of the Chinese Civil War. I will say this, and I say this hopefully I hope you understand with your family background. I mean, no offense. Marshall became convinced that Chiang Kai-shek was very corrupt and was not the right leader for the nationalist forces in China. Ended up after his year with a very low opinion of Chiang, and came back saying, if there's going to be a reason that this conflict is lost, it's going to be that the leadership from Chiang Kai-shek was lacking. He became very close friends with Madame Chiang Kai-shek. She visited he and his wife, his second wife, multiple times through the late 40s and 50s. They became very close. His home in Virginia, there's a lovely painting that Madame Chiang painted for him and for his wife that hangs there. But his opinion of her husband was not so high. And I think he regretted it, but he also recognized that by 1947, 46, when he's in China, Chiang Kai-shek was clearly the unquestioned leader of the nationalist forces. But he did recognize his shortcomings, and I think at the time said that, maybe not publicly, but certainly in his reports, said that he saw it was going to be very difficult for the nationalists to win because of the endemic corruption of Chiang and what he allowed to take place under him.
I'd like to learn more about the Marshall.
The microphone.
I'd like to learn more about the Marshall Plan and some of the details and where the money actually was directed. So if I go out to the foundation, at the website, we'll be able to download or look at the various. Okay, thank you. I think you answered the question.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, there's great material, and it's really a remarkable story because, as I mentioned, $13 billion. Almost half of it was repaid. It was in the form of loans, and the rest was in just outright grants. But it was remarkable. The United States offered the Marshall Plan to every European nation, whether they had been friend or foe. Offered it to the Soviet Union, all the nations of the Eastern Bloc, what came to be the Eastern Bloc. And in some ways, it was a precipitating event for the start of the Cold War, because the Soviets leaned on the countries over which they had sway to reject the plan. In fact, Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, told the story. Her father was in the government of Czechoslovakia, and very much was a proponent of accepting Marshall Plan aid when it was offered in 1948. And because of that, his family they were forced to flee because of his loud championing of being a part of the Marshall Plan. So she emigrated to the United States as a very little girl, in no small part because Czechoslovakia was pressured to turn down Marshall Plan funds.
Thank you, Dr. Levengood. Just a tremendous presentation. Could you comment on General Marshall's view of the formation of NATO? Was it to be a U.S.-led, or did he prefer a European-led alliance? Thank you.
I think Marshall was certainly very keen on building coalitions. Obviously, it had been something he had done a great deal of work on during World War II. And I think he always knew from a practical standpoint that the United States would play a huge, predominant role in it. But he was insistent, as he was with the Marshall Plan, that this not be simply a United States effort that everyone went along with. So in the North Atlantic Treaty, as well as in how the Marshall Plan came about, he was a very, very vocal proponent of European involvement. So this was not simply something that America imposed on other countries, but worked as a partnership with, even though from a practical consideration, the United States was probably always going to play an oversized role.
I've got a quick question about the Nobel Peace Prize. So General Marshall was the only, and still is, the only military member ever to receive the Peace Prize. So this was in 1953, I think you said.
Correct.
Who were the other contenders being considered for the Peace Prize at that time?
Oh gosh, I I do not remember. I do not remember.
I remember everything. It's okay.
Yeah, no, I can't. It's although it was remarkable the the ceremony for the Peace Prize is in Oslo rather than Stockholm, and he was quite ill by the end of the war, and actually was really fairly sick the rest of his life, and he was sick most of the way over. Took a little trivia question for those of you. He took a ship called the Andrea Doria to Europe, which of course later sank. But when he arrives, he didn't realize he had to give two different addresses, and during one of his addresses, it was interrupted by protesters who were saying, this is terrible. You're giving a man responsible for death and destruction as a military leader a prize for peace. And of course, they missed the point, which was he was not receiving this award for anything to do with his wartime career, but with the diplomacy, the humanitarianism, and the international cooperation shown in the Marshall Plan. So I wish I could remember who the other contenders were, but
All right.
off the top of my head, I just don't. I don't remember.
All right, folks. Any last questions for Dr. Levengood? Then let's give him a final round of applause. My colleague from Lexington, Virginia, is here to say hello to us in Lexington, Massachusetts. The wonders of technology. Paul, thank you so much for being with us. It was great. We've wanted to do a program on General Marshall for at least 3 years. We haven't found the right person, but we found you, and we were just so happy. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and goodbye from the other Lexington.